Hey guys, this is Chapter 3, Biopsychology. So biopsychology explores the biological mechanisms that underlie behavior. Among many things, it studies genetics, focusing on how inherited genes can affect not just the physiological but psychological traits of a person, the structure and function of the nervous system, and how the nervous system interacts with the endocrine system. Studying human genetics can help researchers understand the biological basis underlying the different behaviors, thoughts, and reactions of humans. Why do two people infected by the same disease have different outcomes? Are there genetic components to psychological disorders such as depression? How are genetic diseases passed through family lines? Studying human genetics helps us answer these questions and more. We'll look first at the theory of evolution. Charles Darwin explored the concept of inheritance of traits throughout generations in his theory of evolution through natural selection. His theory stated that the organisms that are better suited for their environment will survive and reproduce, while those that are poorly suited for their environment will die off. Characteristics and behaviors that impact survival and reproduction include those that help protect against predators, those that increase access to food, and those that help offspring to live. In 1859, Darwin proposed his theory of evolution by natural selection in his book On the Origin of Species. The book contained just one illustration, and it's this diagram that shows how species evolve over time through natural selection. So why have certain genetic diseases that cause people to die not become less common? Here's an example. Sickle cell anemia is a genetic condition in which red blood cells take on a crescent-like shape, affecting how they function. It causes many people to die at an early age, but it's still common among people of African descent. Carriers of only one copy of the sickle cell gene are thought to be immune from malaria, a deadly disease which is common in Africa. In this example, carrying the gene makes a person better suited for the environment. So genetic differences exist between individuals and contribute to our adaptation to our environment. Genetic variation begins when an egg containing 23 chromosomes is fertilized by a sperm containing 23 chromosomes. A chromosome is a long strand of genetic information known as DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, which is a helix-shaped molecule made of nucleotide base pairs. In each chromosome, there are sequences of DNA that make up genes. Genes are sequences of DNA that control or partially control physical characteristics known as traits. Some examples are eye color, hair color. A gene may have multiple possible variations or alleles, which are specific versions of a gene. A specific gene may code for hair color, and the different alleles of that gene will determine what the hair color will be. Genotype refers to the genetic makeup of an individual based on the genetic material, or DNA, inherited from one's parents. And phenotype describes those characteristics that are part of the genotype, but observable characteristics, such as hair color, skin color, height, and build. The majority of inheritable traits are controlled by more than one gene, and in these cases, we refer to them as polygenic traits. Some traits are controlled by one gene, but most are polygenic. Alleles can be dominant or recessive. In the example below, capital A is the dominant allele for flower color purple, and lowercase a is the recessive allele for flower color white. Possession of a dominant allele will always result in expression of that phenotype. This could be inherited from one parent or both parents. The phenotype of a recessive allele will only be physically expressed if the person is homozygous for that allele, meaning they inherited a recessive allele from both parents. So heterozygous means consisting of two different alleles, and homozygous means consisting of two identical alleles. You may be familiar with Punnett squares. A Punnett square is a tool that's used to predict how genes will interact in the production of offspring. In this case, the capital B represents the dominant allele, and the lowercase b represents the recessive allele. In the example of the cleft chin, where capital B is the cleft gene, or the dominant allele, a pair contains the dominant allele B, resulting in the cleft chin phenotype. You can expect a smooth chin phenotype only when there are two copies of the recessive allele. Here's another example. In this Punnett square, N represents the dominant allele, capital N, and lowercase p represents the recessive allele that is associated with PKU. If two individuals mate who are both heterozygous for the allele associated with PKU, their offspring have a 25% chance of expressing the PKU phenotype. So where do harmful genes like PKU come from? Some are the result of mutations. Mutations are sudden, permanent changes in a gene, and while they can be, and do sound scary, many mutations are harmful and can actually be beneficial. Nature and nurture work together like complex pieces of a human puzzle, and the interaction of our environment and genes makes us the individuals that we are. There are a few different ways to look at this interaction. The first is the range of reaction theory. It's a bit more controversial, and it asserts that our genes set the boundaries within which we can operate, and our environment then determines where within those boundaries we will fall. A more widely accepted view is the genetic environmental correlation. This view of gene-environment interaction asserts that our genes affect our environment, and our environment influences the expression of our genes. The field of epigenetics studies gene-environment interactions to try to understand these experiences better. We'll look now at the structure of a neuron. The function of a neuron is aided by specific aspects of its structure. Its semi-permeable membrane allows smaller molecules or molecules without an electrical charge to pass through it, while stopping larger or highly charged molecules. Incoming electrical signals from other neurons are received by the dendrites, which then send the signal down the axon. So the illustration here shows a prototypical neuron which is being myelinated. Axons are covered in a myelin sheath made of fatty substance that insulates axons and allows the signal to travel down the axon quicker. At the end of the axons are terminal buttons which contain synaptic vessels, and these are storage sites for chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. The synapse is the space between the terminal button of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron. It's sometimes referred to as the synaptic gap. In this pseudo-colored image from a scanning electron microscope, a terminal button, shown in green, has been opened to reveal the synaptic vesicles, shown in orange and blue inside. Each vesicle contains about 10,000 neurotransmitter molecules. At resting potential, sodium, shown here in blue, is more highly concentrated outside the cell and the extracellular fluid, which is shown in blue, whereas potassium, those purple squares, is more likely to be highly concentrated near the membrane in the cytoplasm or intracellular fluid. Other molecules such as chloride, those are the yellow circles, and negatively charged proteins, the brown squares, help contribute to a positive net charge in the extracellular fluid and a negative net charge in the intracellular fluid. Neurotransmitters from nearby neurons attach to receptors on dendrites, causing the membrane potential to change. Depolarization is when the membrane potential becomes less negative, making the neuron more likely to fire, or excitation. And hyperpolarization is when the membrane potential becomes more negative, making the neuron less likely to fire, or inhibition. If the level of charge reaches the threshold of excitation, an action potential will occur. Ion channels open, causing sodium to rush into the cell and the inside to momentarily become more positive. The threshold of excitation, or the level of charge in the membrane that causes the neuron to become active, has to be reached, and then the action potential, which is just an electrical signal, is what will create that. Action potentials act on an all or none principle, so the incoming signal is either sufficient to reach the threshold or it's not. During the action potential, the electrical charge across the membrane changes dramatically. You can see this here also in your text. And once an action potential has occurred, excess neurotransmitters in the synapse or synaptic gap either drift away or are broken down or reabsorbed. Reuptake involves moving a neurotransmitter from the synapse back into the axon terminal from which it was released. So neurotransmitters are chemical messengers of the nervous system. Different neurons release different types of neurotransmitters that have many different functions. Under the biological perspective, which is a view that psychological disorders like depression and schizophrenia are associated with imbalances in one or more neurotransmitter systems, the goal is to reestablish balance with neurotransmitters. Sometimes we do this by letting them stay in that synapse a little bit longer, and sometimes we do this by inhibiting them from going into it at all. Here are some examples of common neurotransmitters that you hear about throughout the text, and I'll share some more in just a bit. Acetylcholine affects muscle action and memory. Beta endorphins are involved with pain and pleasure. Dopamine is involved with mood, sleep, and learning. Norepinephrine is involved with the heart, the intestines, and alertness. And serotonin is also involved with mood and sleep. So under that biological view, the way that we try to reestablish balance with neurotransmitters is through the use of psychotropic medication. These are drugs that treat psychiatric symptoms by restoring neurotransmitter balance. They can be agonists or antagonists. An agonist is a drug that mimics or strengthens the effects of a neurotransmitter. An antagonist is a drug that blocks or impedes the normal activity of a given neurotransmitter. Agonist-antagonist drugs are prescribed to correct neurotransmitter imbalances, and here are two examples. Parkinson's disease is associated with low levels of dopamine, and dopamine agonists are often prescribed as one form of treatment. Schizophrenia, on the other hand, is associated with too much dopamine, and many antipsychotic drugs are therefore dopamine antagonists. We'll look now at parts of the nervous system. We'll first break it into its two major parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is made up of two different parts, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system relays sensory and motor information to and from the central nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system controls our internal organs and glands and can be divided into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system, think of it as having sympathy for you when you're in distress, is involved in stress-related activities and functions, and it prepares us for fight or flight. The fight or flight response is activation of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and allows us to access energy reserves and heighten sensory capacity so that we can fight off a given threat or run away to safety. The parasympathetic nervous system is associated with our routine day-to-day operations of the body under relaxed conditions, and it is also what kicks in after the sympathetic nervous system has been activated to bring us back to a state of equilibrium. And we refer to that as the rest and restore response. This is in your text as well, so you can take a look at it more closely if you'd like later. And it's just showing you the subdivisions of the nervous system. Again, the two major parts being the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And then the peripheral nervous system being further broken down into the somatic and the autonomic systems. The autonomic being further broken down into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system have the opposite effects on various systems. Remember that the parasympathetic nervous system is involved in our resting kind of day-to-day maintenance, and it's also involved in helping us come back to a state of equilibrium after the sympathetic nervous system has been activated. The sympathetic nervous system, when activated, is essentially going to heighten all of the functions that are going to help us to flee or to fight, and it is going to decrease or stop the functions that are not important to survival in the moment. We'll look now at the brain and spinal cord. The brain is comprised of billions of interconnected neurons and glia. It's bilateral, meaning two-sided, and it can be separated into distinct lobes, but all areas interact with one another. The spinal cord delivers messages to and from the brain. It has its own system of reflexes. The top merges with the brainstem, and the bottom ends just below our ribs. It's functionally organized into 30 segments, each connected to a specific part of the body through the peripheral nervous system. Sensory nerves bring messages in and up to the brain. Motor nerves send messages out into the muscles and organs. In moments of survival, automatic reflexes allow motor commands to be initiated without sending signals from sensory nerves to the brain first, allowing us to have very quick reactions. So we'll look at the two hemispheres. Lateralization is the concept that each hemisphere of the brain is associated with specialized functions. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. The surface of the brain is covered with gyri and sulci. A deep sulcus is called a fissure, such as the longitudinal fissure that divides the brain into the left and right hemispheres. The corpus callosum connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain, and what you're seeing here is an example of a sheep brain that's actually been dissected and spread apart so that you can see that corpus callosum. Look now at the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. The brain and its parts can be divided into three main categories, and they are the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. The forebrain is the largest part of the brain, and it contains the cerebral cortex. This is where all of our higher level processes take place. The thalamus, which is our sensory relay center. The hypothalamus, which assists in homeostasis. The pituitary gland, which is considered the master gland of the endocrine system. And the limbic system, which is involved with our emotion and memory. So the cerebral cortex is the surface of the brain, and again, it's associated with our highest mental capabilities such as consciousness, thought, emotion, reasoning, language, and memory. It can be broken up into 4 lobes, each with a different function: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. The frontal lobe is involved in executive functioning, planning, organization, judgment, attention, reasoning. It also involves motor control, emotion, and language. It contains the motor cortex, which is a strip of cortex involved in planning and coordinating our movements, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for higher level cognitive functioning, and Broca's area, which is a region in the left hemisphere that's essential for language production. If this area is damaged, we would have difficulty producing language. Our text also talks about the case of Phineas Gage. And I encourage you to, in addition to reading your text, of course, if you have time, check out YouTube. There are a couple of good, quick documentaries about him as well. The parietal lobe is involved in processing various sensory and perceptual information. It contains the primary somatosensory cortex, which is essential for processing sensory information from across the body, such as touch, temperature, and pain. And as you can see in the picture, it's organized topographically. The temporal lobe is associated with hearing, memory, emotion, and some aspects of language. It's located on the side of the head, near the temples, and it contains the auditory cortex and Wernicke's area. The auditory cortex is a strip of cortex in the temporal lobe that's responsible for processing auditory information. And Wernicke's area is important for speech comprehension. Damage to this area would make it difficult for us to understand language. The occipital lobe is associated with visual processing. It contains the primary visual cortex, which is responsible for interpreting incoming visual information, and it's organized retinotopically. The thalamus serves as the relay center of the brain, where most of our senses, except for smell, are routed before being directed to the other areas of the brain for processing. The limbic system is involved in mediating emotional responses and memory. It's made up of a number of different structures, some of the most important ones being the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the hypothalamus. The amygdala, which is my favorite part of the brain, is involved in our experience of emotion and tying emotional meaning to our memories. It's also heavily involved in processing fear and aggression. The hippocampus is a structure associated with learning and memory, in particular spatial memory. And the hypothalamus regulates homeostatic processes, including body temperature, appetite, and blood pressure. The midbrain includes the reticular formation, the substantia nigra, and the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. The reticular formation is important in regulating the sleep-wake cycle, arousal, alertness, and motor activity. The substantia nigra, where dopamine is produced, is also involved in control of movement. The ventral tegmental area, or VTA, is where dopamine is produced as well, and it's associated with mood, reward, and addiction. It's a really important area when we're studying the impact of various addictions and the reward center in particular. The generation of the substantia nigra and VTA is involved in Parkinson's disease. The hindbrain includes the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. The medulla controls automated processes like our breathing, blood pressure, and heart rate. The pons connects the brain and the spinal cord, and it's involved in regulating brain activity during sleep. And the cerebellum controls our balance, coordination, movement, and motor skills, and it's thought to be important in processing some types of memory. Together, these 3 structures are known as the brain stem. We'll look now at different brain imaging techniques so that you can see how we've learned so much about the brain. The first is computerized tomography, or a CT scan. It involves X-rays and creates an image through X-rays passing through varied densities within the brain. It can be used to show brain tumors. The next is the positron emission tomography, or the PET scan. A PET scan is helpful for showing activity in different parts of the brain. It involves injecting individuals with a mildly radioactive substance and monitoring changes in blood flow to different regions of the brain. Next, we have MRI and fMRI. An MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, is a technique that uses magnetic fields to produce a picture of the tissue being imaged. And then the functional magnetic resonance imaging helps us to see changes in metabolic activity over time. The next is the electroencephalography, or EEG. We use this a lot when we're trying to see brain wave activity for different functions. So it involves recording the electrical activity of the brain via electrodes on the scalp. And using caps with electrodes, the modern EEG research can study the precise timing of overall brain activities by tracking amplitude and frequency of brain waves. The endocrine system is a series of glands that produce hormones to regulate normal body functionings. The hypothalamus links the nervous system and endocrine system by controlling the pituitary gland. And again, the pituitary gland is considered the master gland, meaning that it controls the secretions of all of the other glands. The thyroid secretes thyroxine, which regulates growth, metabolism, and appetite. The adrenal gland secretes hormones involved in the stress response. The gonads secrete sex hormones, which are important for successful reproduction and regulate sexual motivation and behavior. And the pancreas secretes hormones that regulate blood sugar. And finally, here is that list I mentioned earlier that talks about more of the major neurotransmitters. This is definitely not an exhaustive list of the neurotransmitters that we have. These are just the ones that you'll hear about throughout the rest of the text. They'll be referring to these as we study different parts of human experience. Okay? So the first I mentioned earlier, and that's acetylcholine. It's involved in muscle action and memory. The potential effect on behavior includes increased arousal and enhanced cognition. Beta endorphins, again, are involved in pain and pleasure. The potential effect on behavior includes decreased anxiety and decreased tension. Dopamine, again, is involved in mood, sleep, and learning. Potential effects on behavior include increased pleasure and suppressed appetite. Gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, is involved in brain function and sleep. Potential effects on behavior include decreased anxiety and decreased tension. Glutamate is involved in memory and learning. Potential effects on behavior include increased learning, enhanced memory. Norepinephrine is involved with the heart, the intestines, and our alertness. Potential effects on behavior include increased arousal and suppressed appetite. And serotonin is involved in mood and sleep. Potential effects on behavior include modulated mood and suppressed appetite. Again, not an exhaustive list, but you will see these neurotransmitters pop up throughout the rest of the text. That's it for Chapter 3. Read the text, study, do well on your test.